Good morning, John. It's great you've made some time to talk to us. I'm very grateful. Thanks.
Well, it's great to be with you, Henry. Thanks for having me on this morning.
I'd like to start asking you about something that really struck me about your book, Reaching for the Jaguar, which was that for an economist, it seemed more like a story of spiritual awakening. So I wondered why you'd written that sort of book rather than economics.
Well, Henry, so I was chief economist at a major consulting firm, better known as an economic hitman.
Yeah.
But before I did that, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Amazon with indigenous people and studied shamanism. And so after I quit being an economic hitman in the early 80s, I started working again with the indigenous people. And I wrote 5 books on indigenous cultures and shamans, Shapeshift, The World as You Dream It, Psychonavigation, and others. And then later, after 9/11, I wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which became a big-time bestseller, over 2 million copies, et cetera, et cetera. And then I wrote 3 more books on global economics and intrigue.
So have you written books that are more like an economist would expect them to, and this is more on a sort of spiritual awakening, psychological dimension?
Yeah, well, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, The Secret History of the American Empire, Hoodwinked, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, those are all books that are about global economics and intrigue. They're written as narrative nonfiction. I tell stories about what I experienced in my life, but they go deep into the theories of economics, the death economy versus the life economy, how we need to make that transition, how we've created an economic system globally that's a failure now and we need to change it. So 4 books on that subject, yes. And I got invited to speak around the world at many different conferences and summits. On the one hand, corporate conferences and international economic summits, with major CEOs from around the world. And I was often asked at those conferences that somebody might come up and say, hey, are you the same guy who wrote those 5 books on shamanism, are you? And then I would speak at shamanic or indigenous or what we might call New Age conferences around the world at various places. And people would come up and say, hey, you can't be the same guy that wrote the books on economics, can you? Like Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And to me, there was always a very strong connection between the two, because shamanism is based on the idea that we alter reality by changing perceptions. Economics is based on the same idea. Marketing, advertising is all about creating perceptions that have an impact on reality. And so I always saw a very strong connection between these two seemingly disparate, but I never overtly discussed it until this book, Touching the Jaguar. Here it is. I don't know whether you can see it straight forward or whether it's backwards on your screen.
No, it looks great. That's great. I got the electronic without the cover.
Yeah.
So
well, the subtitle, Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life and the World, that's the secret behind it, because transforming fear into action to change things is the basis of shamanism. It's also the basis of modern psychotherapy, quantum physics, marketing, advertising. Practically everything we do as human beings is controlled by the way we perceive things.
So it's interesting because economics itself, or mainstream economics, often doesn't touch that at all. The issue of how you perceive things is not really in there at all, is it?
Well, it certainly is in marketing studies.
Oh, absolutely. And mainstream economics ignores marketing almost, doesn't it?
Yeah, so my real title is I was chief economist at a major consulting firm. I had 30 to 50 people working for me at various times. And my job was to go to countries that had resources our corporations want, like oil, and arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money had to be used to hire our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in those countries, things like electric power systems and highways and industrial parks that benefited our corporations that built them, and also a few wealthy families in the country, the families that controlled the country, basically, but didn't help the majority of the people because money was diverted from healthcare, education, and other social services to pay off the service on the debt. My job really, and my staff's job, was to follow my lead and produce these fancy economic reports that showed that when you invest all this money in infrastructure projects in a poor country, the economy grows. And statistically, if we use GDP, which is the measure that's used, that's true. But what I came to understand is that GDP is a terrible measure of prosperity. It says nothing about general prosperity. It's all about the rich people. So, for example, right now in the United States, we have 3 individuals who have as much wealth as half the US population. If those 3 individuals made 10% on their investments last year, and half the population lost 3%, so that the individuals made 10%, the half the population lost 3%. They lost money. You'd show a GDP growth of something around 5%. So what we see is that these statistics are faulty. They measure the wealthy, but they don't measure true prosperity.
So would you say that these statistics are almost a sort of marketing ploy? They're a way of shifting how we see reality rather than something that's really designed to give anything any truth?
They're shifting at how we create reality. That's what I'm saying. So an economist like me, my job was to create a perception through fancy reports and econometric studies that these things were good for the country. And then the president of the country could go out and show these studies publicly, get them printed in the newspaper and show, hey, we take on these big loans, our economy is going to grow. And people believe it. And they believe it in the United States today. They believe it in the United Kingdom. They believe it. And it's faulty. Only a sector of the economy grows, it reflects, and the other sector might grow or might decline, but you can still show growth. So what we're doing is creating a perception that then has a huge impact on reality, how money is allocated, how it's spent, where it goes, who it goes to.
And I suppose it's interesting you put it that way, because if you went to your standard economists, they'd say, we're very rigorous, we're objective. And actually, I have a similar experience to you in terms of working in government, where the reality is economists are obviously often the slaves. Give me some numbers that support the policy. But economists find that very difficult to admit to.
Well, it's ingrained in business school and economics that these statistics are valid. But I will say that there's a lot of economists who would agree with me. Joe Stiglitz is one of them. He was chief economist at the World Bank, won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he writes very similar things to what I write. He writes them for academics and economists. He writes kind of an essay form. I write a storytelling of what's called narrative nonfiction, because I want to reach a much larger general public. But we say very similar things. Stiglitz said that at the World Bank, when he was chief economist there, their studies were not driven by what they really wanted to show as the truth. Their studies were driven by policy issues and issues of how they could get involved in countries, how the World Bank could use these loans to influence other countries and the allocation of those other countries' resources.
Because the World Bank, at the end of the day, has to get money out the door, hasn't it, as well?
Yeah. But so in all of this system, Henry, what I realized, I was a driver in this system. I was a big driver in this system. In the beginning, I believed in it because it's what I've been taught in business school. And over time, probably because I'd been in the Peace Corps, living in the Amazon for 3 years and in the high Andes, I came to understand, because I'm fluent in Spanish and I could talk to people like Omar Torrijos, the head of state of Panama, who was very strongly opposed to this, what he called American colonialism, exploitation. And I began to see how wrong these statistics were. But, what we all have to do to understand it. So this perception has been created, and it's become the norm of perception, and it's molded reality. It's created super economies like the United States, and now China's growing into that. But it's wrong. It's also created most of the problems we have today, whether it's climate change or income inequality, species extinction, now the coronavirus. These all are problems, but they're symptoms of the bigger problem, what economists are increasingly calling a death economy, the current economic system that is consuming itself into extinction and in the process destroying the world as we know it, destroying our environment. That's a death economy, and we need to transition into what we call now a life economy, and I can talk more about that if you want.
What I was keen to talk about is that key focus of your book is the sort of trip to the Amazon to reconceive, re-understand the nature of the world. And one thing I sort of thought was that not that many people can go to the Amazon. I mean, this sort of refocusing on the understanding of how the world works, this sort of realization of a sort of larger truth. Are there other ways people can do it? Presumably, you'd look at on your doorstep. I mean, you look what's happening in the US at the moment and the history of racial injustice and so on. Is there a more sort of generic version of how people can, refocus and find the truth?
Well, yeah, and that's why I wrote the book. And there's a part of the book at the beginning that's about the Amazon, but it leads into this whole discussion of the death economy and how we transform it into a life economy. And in the process, by the end of the book, it spells out a daily practice that everyone can practice for 10 minutes a day or a little less. And don't need to do it every day, maybe once a week, whatever, that each one of us can practice in order to understand our role in creating a better life for ourselves and the world. So this idea of transforming fear into action to change yourself in the world, the subtitle of the book, is very, very prevalent throughout the book. Now, the Amazonian people provide a really magnificent example in that these tribes where I was living back in 1968 to 71 as a Peace Corps volunteer, they were warring with their neighboring tribes because they're hunters and gatherers and they need to protect their territory. They need very large territories. They weren't really wars. They were more like skirmishes. But they were beginning to understand that the real threat was not the neighbors. They had a new perception. The real threat was American oil and mining companies. And so they changed they went out and they touched their Jaguar. So I touch this Jaguar all the time. Yeah. That means you've got to touch that which you fear. You go to it. You don't run from it. So they understood that their real fear was oil companies and mining companies from other countries, from mainly the United States. And so they banded together with people who had been enemies for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. They changed their perception of who their enemy was. That changed their reality. And then they came to me after that and said, hey, what we really understand now is the real fear is the dream of your people, the perception of your people who depend on oil and mined minerals. It's your people who are the real problem. The only reason the oil companies are coming here is because your people are demanding a lot more and more oil. So we need to change the perception, the dream of your people. Help us form a partnership with the people we fear. So again, they touch this Jaguar. Help us form a partnership. So I worked with Bill and Lynn Twist, and we founded the Pachamam Alliance back in 95, and that's now in 80 some odd countries, helping people understand this process of changing perceptions to promote reality, and also to work on legally protecting areas of the Amazon. But it's all about perception and reality.
Yeah. Can you just, because I suppose a lot of people won't have been to Amazon and experienced that sort of life and how that might work. Can you take a normal, I don't know, middle-class person in the US who has a sort of bog standard job working at a corporation? What are the fears? You say you need to touch your fears and find a way through. What's the way in for someone in that sort of a situation? What are the fears?
So once I realized I was in a big corporation, I was chief economist of this major consulting firm, and I decided I couldn't do that anymore. The fear was that if I left, I wouldn't have an income. I've been trained all my life to do this. And plus, I had grown up the son of a teacher at a boys' boarding school in New Hampshire. The school gave us a home, and I ate in the dining room with 200 boys from the time I was about 4 years old. And my dad made almost no money. And I was surrounded by very, very rich boys who came from Park Avenue, New York. They came from the best areas of London. They came from Buenos Aires, wherever. And so now I become chief economist of this international firm. I've got a huge expense account. I fly first class around the world. I'm making a great salary. I wine and dine with presidents of countries in the finest restaurants. I was afraid of losing that. I thought I would attain the American dream. I couldn't possibly just walk away from it. So there was this fear, and what would I do next? And I had to go out. And so what we say is when we have this fear in front of us, it's like a Jaguar that the indigenous people said. So in a vision quest or a shamanic journey, when they see a Jaguar, and they see this Jaguar, they know it's representing something that they need to do, they want to do, but they're afraid to do it. And
But you
so
wanted
in my case, I knew that I needed to get out of this job. I needed to change. I had to touch that Jaguar and see what it was I needed to do to make the change.
But you, as you said, you had understood to start with you needed to change. And that comes before, then there's the fear of change. But you first have to believe you need to change. And surely there are a lot of people who are quite comfortable in the current situation who don't even get to the point of feeling they need to change, let alone facing fears of change.
Well, maybe some of them don't need to change. Maybe you don't need to change. Maybe you're comfortable in what you do, and it's probably you are, because what you do is a really good thing. But I got to tell you, I've run into over the years hundreds, thousands. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me as I'm giving speeches or have sent me emails or something saying, I hate my job. I make damn good money. I'm realizing the American dream or the British dream or whatever it is, but I'm not happy. I'm working, and this coronavirus has shown a lot. I've heard from so many people recently, I never want to go back to that office. Now I've discovered I don't have to go to the office. I can do it all virtually. I don't want to go back to the office. I'm not even sure I want to work for this kind of a company anymore. So we wake up, and the people who do know that they need to change and want to change, then it's important to go out and touch the Jaguar. And here's an example. So during this time of the pandemic, people may be sitting at home saying, gee, I can't stand to self-isolate another day. Forget about another month or 2 months or whatever. I'm going crazy. What can I do? Well, that's a big Jaguar. Go out and touch that Jaguar, and it may say, did you always want to learn to play the flute? You got a flute. You go on the internet. Didn't you always want to read more books or write a book or start a podcast or whatever? Well, here's your opportunity now that you're stuck at home during this period. Here's your opportunity to go out and touch that Jaguar and say, hey, I'm going to use this period of isolation beneficially. I'm going to take action to confront that fear and transform it into something that serves me and hopefully helps other people too.
I just think, just moving on a bit, I felt there were two themes in your book. One was obviously colonialization, which is really about power, isn't it? A country that has the power to go and extract and take resources from other countries or other people within its country. And so there's that theme of power. And then there's the theme of awakening, facing your fears, seeing the world in a different way. Now, I just wonder how those sort of related, because you might say, well, it's all very well seeing the world in a different way, but when you're confronted by brute power of people who have resources to buy you out, to buy the government out, to buy the police, et cetera, what does mental awakening count for?
Well, colonialization is to a certain degree about power, and especially that under the old model. Under the model I was working on, I was colonizing the world, but based on fear and debt. And so tell a president basically, so here, take out this big loan, put your country deep into debt, and it's going to benefit you and a few others, but these presidents knew it was going to hurt everybody else. Or I would also say, if you don't buy into this, there's the jackals in the background. The jackals are people who usually CIA assets who overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. And every one of these presidents that I had dealt with knew about what had happened to Salvador Allende in Chile, and President Arbenz of Guatemala, and Mossadegh of Iran, and Lumumba of the Congo, and Diem of Vietnam, and on and on and on and on. The United States has admitted to doing these things. So my job was relatively easy. I'm standing in front of a president. I say, hey, in this hand, I got several $1 billion for you to use to build infrastructure that's going to help you and your family get richer. Or if you don't do that, in this hand, I got a gun. I didn't have a gun, but I knew that those people were back there. I didn't even know most of them personally, but they were back there. And these guys knew the presidents knew they were back there too. So that's a perception of fear. And it wasn't just power. I wasn't threatening to bring in the military, but it was a threat of fear. And for the rest of us, we fear change. We fear that if we're going to change our economic situation, are we going to have to go back and live in caves? So the colonialization is not just, overt power. It's also, it's a colonizing the mindset, colonizing perceptions of people.
And so do you feel that actually by addressing the colonizing of the mind, you can actually address the power?
No question about it. So here, you're in England, I'm in the United States, and if we go back to 1774, your country controlled mine as part of the British Empire. And most everybody in America believed that the British were invincible, undefeatable, strongest army in the world. And then George Washington went before the Continental Congress, and he remembered a time during the French and Indian War, what's known in Europe as the 7-Year War, 20 years earlier, when he'd been part of a big British military movement under General Braddock, the England's best general at the time, I think. Huge, massive force of British soldiers marching into what became Pittsburgh. And they were ambushed by a handful, a much smaller force of French and Indians, and slaughtered. Braddock himself was killed. Washington was there. He happened to make it out. And he remembered that in 1775. And he said to Congress, he said, hey, the British aren't invincible. All we got to do is change our perception of warfare and hide behind trees. And of course, the British yelled foul. You can't do that. You got to stand in these lines and face each other, man to man. You know, you got to be brave. Kind of like what the Americans did in Vietnam many years later, when we said the Viet Cong can't use the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They're not allowed to go into Laos and Cambodia. That's not fair. And of course, now we say it's not fair for the Iranians to have nuclear weapons, even though they're surrounded by people with nuclear weapons. You know, Russia, Israel, the United States, and India, and they're just surrounded by people. I don't like nuclear weapons. I'm not defending that. But to be so hypocritical is to say, hey, that's not fair in war. So, you know, when perceptions change like that, so George Washington had a major impact. Suddenly, everybody's perception said, oh, my God, yeah, the French defeated the British there at that Battle of the Monongahela. Of course, they ultimately lost the war, and Britain got Canada. But it was this pivotal moment in history. And history's full of those. You know, Copernicus, when he showed the world that the universe didn't revolve around planet Earth, that changed religion, that changed philosophy, that changed our perception of who we are in the universe. It changed everything. And these, you know, Columbus, you can go on and on and on and on. History's just full of, and these changes always happen. Reality changes because our perceptions change.
So do you see us now at a pivotal moment? Do you see the potential for perceptions to change?
Absolutely. What we're all beginning to understand around the world, and I speak at conferences in Russia and China and all over. England, recently spoke at Oxford and Cambridge. And, you know, people are feeling this, we have to change. This system just simply is not working. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. There's desperation, there's climate change, there's all kinds of signals that we got to change. And we've been on a trajectory. So we've seen the rise of benefit corporations, B corporations, what we call conscious capitalism. In the United States, the Green New Deal. In last August, 192 of the world's most powerful, most successful corporate CEOs came together at the Business Roundtable and made a statement that basically we've got to move into a life economy. So they said that no longer can we accept that the goal of corporations is to maximize short-term profits regardless of social and environmental costs. That's been the goal for quite a few years now. And that's been driving business. Maximize short-term profits. That creates a death economy. A life economy is an economy that's based on the perception that the goal is to maximize long-term benefits for people and nature, benefiting long-term, paying companies to invest in cleaning up pollution, paying companies to invest in regenerating destroyed environments, and coming up with new technologies that don't ravage the earth, that use more of the sun and the wind and the air to create everything. We've been moving along that trajectory. And there's no question that that's been happening. And I think this coronavirus is the most recent, pushing us even further in that direction. It's showing us that, you know, you can see stars above Beijing. You can see stars above Los Angeles.
I suppose you can tell a number of stories about what's happening at the moment, but there's another story, which is We have Trump, we have Johnson, we have governments that do work very hard to create perceptions, but perceptions that many would think are quite negative. We have the likes of Amazon and other digital companies that have quasi-monopolistic powers through their power of networks and seem incredibly good at extracting huge amounts of wealth from the general populace. So it's not a sort of straightforward regression, is it?
Well, if you look at history, whenever there's what we might call a revolution, it doesn't have to be a physical revolution. It can be something like the Enlightenment. There's always a pushback. And we're in a revolution right now. There's a consciousness revolution of people waking up to the fact we live on a fragile space station and there aren't any shuttles. We can't get off. We got to take care of it. And people are really waking up to the fact that we, the pilots of the space station, we guide it. We've been guiding it toward disaster. We need to reboot the navigation system. People are really waking up to that around the world. There's no question. And always, though, when there's a revolution, there's a pushback. There's a pushback. And so right now, yes, the Trumps and the Johnsons and many others are pushing back.
If you look around the leaders at the moment, I mean, and look for enlightenment, you probably have to go to New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Norway, possibly, small, tiny countries that may get publicity, but in the scheme of things are hardly going to create the sort of global change we need.
Well, I don't know. Greta Thunberg has had a pretty major effect on the world. And, you know, if you think about it, the United States, when it became the United States, was a pretty small, seemingly insignificant country that fomented the French Revolution and across the world brought out the idea of democracy. Now, we in the United States recently have not done a very good job at keeping that. We've done a terrible job. We're not what we call a democratic republic, but we're not doing a good job. But we did create this perception that has since reached around the world. It's driven so much. At one point, I think it was Churchill after the World War II who said, you know, the United Kingdom, we can either be a democracy or an empire. What do we choose? And you chose democracy, basically, or you chose, you know, that form of parliamentarian rule rather than to continue with the old colonial ways of around the world. So these movements can start. I mean, they may start in Iceland, they may start in Norway, but they're also really picking up here in the United States and you know, I've spoken recently in England, and there's a huge undercurrent there of people who are very, very dissatisfied. But at the same time, the status quo steps in to stop it. And revolutionaries or agents of change, I think we'd rather call ourselves at this point, always take energy from that pushback. Just like a martial artist. I've been a martial artist most of my life, and I know that if somebody's a lot bigger and stronger than me, I can't try to fight him, spar with him by beating him physically. I've got to use his energy and my own smarts to redirect his energy, tire him out, redirect his energy back at him. And that's what happens with agents of change. When the pushback comes, something else happens. So in the United States today, we've seen Trump really stand up for racism and white privilege. I mean, that's what he's done. And yet there's a huge pushback. The riots are happening hugely. And so many people, so many privileged white men like me. I mean, there's no question. I grew up white, male, American. I grew up with privileges I didn't ask for and I didn't try to get, but they're there. They're always there. And so many people in that position who didn't really see it before are truly beginning to understand the injustice. I think that there's a big counter wave against the Johnsons and the Trumps. And of course, we'll see in the next election what's going to happen if we can trust the electoral process at all. But for sure, revolutions have always taken power from those who've pushed back against them. And usually the revolutions have won, ultimately. Not always. Not always. So we don't know. I don't have a crystal ball.
Well, let's end with that more positive note and hope we can create the revolution that we need. Thank you very much, John. That's been really fascinating talking with you.
My pleasure, Henry. And I would just like to add, if I could, that I think that we're in an amazingly incredible time right now. People to be alive right now are blessed because we are in this time with the opportunity for transformation. And I'd also like to encourage people to go to my website, johnperkins.org, And there they can see how they can get, they can pre-order the book if they want, but they can also get a workbook that goes into this little daily practice. It's very short. It's very easy, where we ask ourselves 5 basic questions, each one personally, whether you're a carpenter or a plumber or a podcast host or an author, a parent, whatever you are. It takes you down a course where you can make life better for you. And in the process, do something to help somebody else, because we're all happier when we help one other person or the whole world, whatever it is. I really encourage people to look positively on this time, despite all the challenges and the discomforts and the illness and the death. This is a remarkable time to be alive in history. It's a time to really wake up, to really touch that jaguar, move forward into transformation. And thank you, Henry, for all you do to bring this information out there to inspire people. I really appreciate what you do.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, and look forward to talking another time.